My name's Lucas. I'm 24, living in a small apartment on the edge of Denver, Colorado, where the city hums just loud enough to remind you it's there, but not so loud it drowns out your thoughts. I work freelance as a coder, mostly building websites for small businesses, coffee shops, yoga studios, that kind of thing. It's not glamorous, but it pays the rent and lets me work from my couch in sweatpants. My life's been steady, predictable. Wake up code, maybe hit the trails for a run if I'm feeling ambitious. I'm not big on crowds or chaos, never have been. Maybe that's why I've always kept people at arm's length. I had a girlfriend once back in college. We lasted 6 months before she said I was too closed off. She wasn't wrong. I've got walls and I'm okay with them. My best friend Jake, though, he's the opposite. He's 24 too, a sales guy with a grin that could sell ice to a snowman. He's always dragging me into something bar crawls, pick up basketball road trips I don't have the energy for. Last week he called me up voice buzzing like he'd already had 3 energy drinks. Lucas, you gotta come with me to Aspen, ski trip. Couple days, my treat. I groaned. Skiing's not my thing. I'm more of a stay inside with a laptop guy than a hurtling down a mountain one. But Jake's relentless. Come on, man, my mom's coming too. She needs a break. It'll be fun, like a family vibe. I didn't have a good excuse to say no, and honestly, Jake's got a way of making you feel like you're missing out on life if you don't say yes. So I packed a bag, threw in some thermals I hadn't touched since high school, and said fine. Jake's mom, Elena, is 44. I've known her since I was 15, back when Jake and I started hanging out. She's always been hard to read. Not cold exactly, but not the warm, cookie-baking mom type either. She's got this quiet intensity, like she's seen more than she lets on. I remember her picking Jake up from school in this beat-up Jeep, always with a book or a camera on the passenger seat. She used to be a war photographer, Jake told me once, but now she edits articles for some online magazine. She's got long brown hair usually tied back and these deep green eyes that seem to catch everything. I never thought much about her beyond Jake's mom. She was just there. Polite, reserved, maybe a little distant. Beautiful, sure, but in that off-limits way you don't dwell on, or at least I didn't, not until this trip. We got to the ski resort in Aspen on a Friday afternoon. The place was straight out of a postcard, snow-dusted pines cabins with smoke curling from chimneys and air so crisp it stung your lungs. Jake had booked us into a lodge near the slopes, all wood beams and plaid blankets, the kind of place that smells like pine and hot cocoa. His crew, 3 other guys, and a girl, all loud and ready to tear up the mountain, were already unpacking snowboards and cracking beers. I felt out of place like I always do in groups like that. Jake was in his element joking, tossing a football he'd brought for no reason. Elena, though she was quieter. She sat by the lodge's big window sipping coffee from a thermos, her red scarf draped over her chair. She smiled when Jake waved her over but didn't join the chaos. I caught her eye once and she gave me a small nod like she knew I wasn't here for the party either. By the second morning I was beat. Jake and his friends had been up late laughing and blasting music and I'd barely slept. They were planning to snowboard through some backcountry trails in a pine forest nearby a few miles from the lodge. You and Lucas. Jake asked, zipping up his jacket. I shook my head. Nah, man, I'm good. Think I'll just chill here. He shrugged, already halfway out the door with his crew. I grabbed a coffee and sank into a couch by the fireplace, scrolling my phone, figuring I'd wait out the day. That's when Elena walked over, her boots crunching on the wood floor. Not joining them, she asked, her voice low but not unfriendly. I looked up, caught off guard. Not really my scene. You. She smiled faintly, adjusting her scarf. I'd rather walk than fall down a mountain. Something about the way she said it made me laugh. Want to take a walk then? There's trails around here, nothing crazy. She tilted her head, considering, then nodded. Sure. Let me grab my thermos. We headed out to a marked trail near the lodge, just a loop through the snow-covered trees. The sky was clear, the sun glinting off the powder, and it felt good to move without the pressure of keeping up with Jake's crew. Elena walked beside me, her red scarf bright against her dark coat steam, rising from her thermos as she sipped. We didn't talk much at first, just small stuff. She asked about my coding gigs. I asked about her editing work. It was easy light, like 2 people passing time. You come up here a lot with Jake, I asked, stepping over a root. She nodded, her eyes scanning the trees. Every year since he was a kid. It's our thing. Her voice softened like there was more to it, but she didn't elaborate. I didn't push. Then the air shifted. The sky grayed fast and a soft flurry started. I zipped my jacket higher, thinking it'd pass. But the snow got heavier, thicker, until the trail markers started to blur. We should head back, I said, squinting through the white. Elena agreed, but when we turned, the path was gone, covered by fresh powder. My stomach tightened. I pulled out my phone, 10% battery, no signal. Shit, I muttered, flicking on the flashlight. Elena stayed calm, but her hands were stuffed deep in her pockets, her breath visible in short puffs. We'll find it, she said, but her voice had an edge now. The snow kept coming, and the world turned into a wall of white. The snow didn't let up. It came down in heavy sheets, swallowing the trail and blurring the trees into ghostly shapes. My phone's flashlight cut a weak beam through the white, barely illuminating a few feet ahead. I kept scanning for the trail markers, those little wooden posts we'd passed earlier, but they were gone, buried under the fresh powder. My boots sank deeper with each step, the cold seeping through my socks, and my breath came out in ragged clouds. Elena walked beside me, her red scarf dusted with snow, her face half hidden by the hood of her coat. She wasn't saying much, but her silence felt heavier than the storm. Lucas, slow down, she said finally, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind. I stopped turning to her, my heart thudding from more than just the cold. We're just going in circles, she added, her green eyes steady but tight at the corners. She was right. I'd been leading us in a loop, hoping to spot something familiar, but the forest looked the same in every direction. My phone was down to 6% battery now, and the signal bars were still flat. I shoved it back in my pocket, trying to hide the shake in my hands. I'm sorry, I said, my voice rougher than I meant. I shouldn't have suggested this walk. I expected her to snap back, maybe blame me for getting us lost, but she just shook her head, brushing snow off her sleeve. It's not your fault, Lucas. Storms like this come out of nowhere up here. Her tone was calm, but her lips were starting to look pale and her hands were buried deep in her pockets. She was colder than she was letting on. We kept moving, trudging through the snow, but every step felt heavier, like the mountain was pushing back. My legs burned and my lungs stung with each icy breath. I glanced at Elena, her scarf now a faint red smudge against the endless white. You okay? I asked, slowing to match her pace. She nodded, but her breath was uneven, and I caught her wincing as she stepped over a hidden root. Just keep going, she said. But her voice had a tremor now, not the steady confidence I was used to. After what felt like forever, probably closer to an hour, I stopped again, my chest heaving. This isn't working, I said, more to myself than her. My mind was racing, picturing us stuck out here all night, the cold creeping deeper until we couldn't move. I'd seen enough survival shows to know how fast things could go wrong in a storm like this. Elena stepped closer, her gloved hand landing on my shoulder. It was light but firm, like she was anchoring me. Lucas, stop. She said, her voice low but sharp enough to pull me out of my spiral. You're panicking and it's making me panic too. We need to think. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see Jake's mom. Her hood had slipped back and snow clung to her brown hair, melting into wet strands across her forehead. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes wide but not scared, just focused, like she was sizing up the situation the way she must have years ago in war zones. But there was something else, too, something raw. Her hand was shaking slightly, not just from the cold, and her lips were pressed tight like she was holding herself together for both of us. In that moment, she wasn't the older, composed woman I'd always known. She was just Elena, stuck out here with me trying to survive. Okay, I said, forcing a slow breath. What do we do? She scanned the trees, her breath puffing out in quick bursts. We need shelter. If we keep wandering, we'll just get more lost. Her voice was steady now, but I could hear the effort behind it. I nodded, swallowing the knot in my throat. Right. Let's look for anything, a cave, a tree hollow, something. She gave a small nod and we started moving again, slower this time, more deliberate. I stayed closer to her, our shoulders brushing as we pushed through the snow. We argued a little as we went, not angry, just tense. I wanted to backtrack, thinking we might find the trail again. She thought we should head downhill where there might be a ranger station. Lucas, we're not finding that trail in this, she said, her voice firm but not harsh. We need to prioritize staying warm. I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. She was right. I was letting panic drive, and it wasn't helping. I reached out almost without thinking and grabbed her gloved hand. "Okay, downhill it is," I said. Her fingers tightened around mine for a second, not letting go right away, and something in that small gesture made the cold feel a little less sharp. We pushed on the snow, piling higher, the wind biting at my face. My phone died completely, leaving us in near darkness as the storm swallowed the last of the daylight. Just when I thought we were done for, Elena pointed ahead. There, she said, her voice sharp with relief. I squinted through the white and saw a faint outline of a structure low and dark against the trees. It was our only shot, and we both knew it. The structure was a small, weathered cabin, barely more than a shed, tucked against a cluster of pines. Its wooden walls were grayed by time, and snow had piled up against the door, but it was shelter, and that was enough. I shoved my shoulder against the door, which creaked open with a groan, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside smelled of damp wood and old dust, but it was dry, and that was all that mattered. My boots scraped against the rough floor as I stepped in, Elena close behind me. "This'll do," she said, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. She was shivering now, her red scarf crusted with snow, her hands stuffed deep in her coat pockets. I scanned the room with the last flicker of my phone's flashlight before it died completely. It was sparse: a rusty wood stove in one corner, a single wooden bench along the wall, a shelf with a few dusty cans of food, and a pile of folded wool blankets in a crate. There was a small stack of kindling and a box of matches next to the stove, thank God. "Let's get that fire going," I said, more to keep myself moving than anything else. My fingers were numb, fumbling with the matches as I knelt by the stove. Elena set her thermos on the bench and started shaking snow off her coat, her movements slow, like the cold had sapped her strength. It took a few tries, but I got the fire started. The kindling caught with a soft crackle, and soon the flames were licking at the dry wood, casting a warm, flickering glow across the cabin. The heat felt like a miracle, pushing back the chill that had settled into my bones. I glanced at Elena, who was sitting on the bench peeling off her wet gloves. Her hair was damp strands clinging to her cheeks, and her lips were still pale, but she managed a small smile. "Not bad, Lucas," she said, her voice softer now. "You're handy in a crisis." I chuckled, the sound rough in my throat. "Yeah, well, don't get used to it." I grabbed 2 blankets from the crate and handed one to her. She draped it over her shoulders, the snow on her coat melting into dark patches. I sat down next to her, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from her. The fire popped, filling the silence, and for a moment we just sat there, catching our breath, letting the heat sink in. I opened one of the cans on the shelf, some kind of beef stew past its expiration date but still sealed. "Dinner?" I asked, half joking. Elena raised an eyebrow, then laughed, a low, warm sound that felt out of place in the cold cabin. "Gourmet," she said, taking the can from me. We shared it, passing it back and forth with a couple of rusty spoons we found, washing it down with the last of the coffee from her thermos. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it made the cabin feel less like a last resort. The fire steadied, and the cabin grew warmer, though the wind still howled outside, rattling the thin walls. Elena leaned back against the wall, her blanket pulled tight around her. "Jake and I used to come up here every winter," she said, her voice quiet, almost like she was talking to herself. "After his dad died, Afghanistan, when Jake was 15, this was our way of keeping things together. Like if we kept doing this, we could pretend the family wasn't broken." She paused, staring into the fire, her fingers tracing the edge of the thermos. I didn't realize how much I was pretending too. I didn't know what to say. I'd never heard her talk like this, not with Jake or anyone. Her words hung in the air, heavy with something I couldn't quite name. I shifted closer, my knee brushing hers under the blanket. "I didn't know," I said, finally, "about his dad, or any of that." She looked at me, her green eyes catching the firelight, and for a second, I saw something raw, unguarded. "Most people don't," she said. "I don't talk about it. Easier to keep moving." I reached out, hesitating, then placed my hand over hers on the thermos. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly, and I didn't pull away. "You don't have to keep moving right now," I said, my voice quieter than I meant. She didn't flinch or pull back. Instead, her fingers curled slightly under mine and she let out a slow breath. "Thanks, Lucas," she said, almost a whisper, "for being here." The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the lines of exhaustion, but also something softer, something alive. I pulled my jacket off. It was damp but still warm from my body and draped it over her shoulders over the blanket. She looked at me surprised, then gave a small nod, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You're gonna freeze," she said, but there was no real protest in her voice. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "I'll survive." But inside my chest was tight, not from the cold but from the way she looked at me like I wasn't just Jake's friend, like I was someone who mattered. We sat there, the fire crackling, the wind screaming outside, and the space between us felt smaller than it ever had. I didn't know what was happening, not exactly, but I knew it wasn't just about staying warm anymore. The fire in the cabin burned steady now, its warm glow pushing shadows across the rough wooden walls. The wind outside howled, rattling the old window panes, but inside the air felt still heavy with something unspoken. Elena sat close to me on the bench, our knees brushing under the shared blanket, my jacket still draped over her shoulders. The faint smell of burning wood mixed with the damp wool of the blankets and the lingering trace of her coffee. Her hand was still under mine, resting on the thermos, her fingers no longer trembling but warm from the fire. Neither of us had moved and the silence wasn't empty, it was full, like it was holding something we hadn't named yet. I looked at her, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek, the wet strands of her brown hair curling against her neck. She was staring into the flames, her green eyes distant but soft, like she was lost in a memory. "You okay?" I asked, my voice low, careful not to break whatever this was. She blinked, turning to me, and for a moment her guard was down completely. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't stopped to think about that in a long time." She shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing mine, and the blanket slipped a little, exposing the damp collar of her coat. I reached out to pull it back up, my fingers grazing her neck, and she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into the touch just enough for me to notice. "When I was a photographer," she said, her voice slow, deliberate, "I saw things most people don't. Bombs, bodies, people who'd lost everything. I learned to keep moving, to keep shooting, because if I stopped, it'd swallow me whole. And when Jake's dad died, I kept moving for him, for us. But somewhere along the way, I think I forgot how to stop, how to just be." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd always seen her as strong, untouchable, the kind of person who had it all together. But now sitting here in this freezing cabin, she was just Elena, not Jake's mom, not the war photographer, not the woman who kept everything in check. She was someone who'd been carrying too much for too long. I tightened my grip on her hand, not sure if it was to comfort her or myself. "You don't have to keep it together now," I said, my voice rougher than I meant. "Not here. Not with me." She turned to face me fully, her eyes searching mine, and the air between us shifted like a door creaking open. "Lucas," she said, her voice softer now, almost fragile. "If this is the last night, if we're stuck here, if this is all we get, I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to be Jake's mom or the strong one or the one who's always fine. I just want to be me, a woman, someone who's still here, still alive." Her words hung there raw and unguarded, and my chest tightened. I could see it in her eyes, the weight of years she'd carried alone, the longing to be seen for something other than her roles. "I see you," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Not as Jake's mom, not as anything else, just you." Her breath caught, and for a moment neither of us moved. The fire crackled, the wind screamed outside, but the world felt like it had narrowed to just us, this cabin, this moment. I don't know who leaned in first, maybe it was her, maybe it was me, but our faces were closer now, her breath warm against my cheek. Her eyes held mine steady but vulnerable, and then her lips brushed mine soft at first, hesitant like she was testing the edge of something dangerous. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, not rushed or desperate, but like we were both trying to say something words couldn't touch. Her hand slid up my arm, resting on my shoulder, and I pulled her closer, the blanket falling to the floor. It wasn't about heat or passion, it was about connection, about two people finding something real in the middle of a storm. Her lips were warm, tasting faintly of coffee, and for those few seconds the cold, the fear, the world outside didn't exist. It was just us tangled in the quiet truth of what we both needed. We pulled back, our foreheads resting together, our breaths mixing in the dim light. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling but not with fear. "I haven't felt this alive in years." I didn't know what to say, so I just held her. my hand resting on the back of her neck, feeling the damp strands of her hair. Me neither, I said, finally, my voice barely audible. I realized then that I'd been just as lost as she was, not in the snow, but in my own life, coding away in my apartment, keeping everyone at a distance. But here with her, I wasn't hiding anymore. We didn't say much after that. The fire kept burning, casting long shadows, and we sat there closer than before, her head resting against my shoulder. The storm outside didn't feel so heavy anymore, not with her next to me. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. The fire in the cabin had settled into a steady glow, its warmth spreading through the small space, though the wind still howled outside, rattling the old walls. Elena and I sat close, wrapped in the wool blankets, our shoulders pressed together, her head resting lightly against mine. The kiss lingered in the air between us, not just in the memory of it, but in the way it had shifted everything, her, me, the silence we shared. It wasn't about what had happened. It was about what it meant. For the first time, I saw her not as Jake's mom, not as the woman who'd always seemed untouchable, but as someone fragile, real, needing the same thing I did, to feel something true, even if just for a night. We didn't go further. There was no rush, no need to push past the moment we'd already shared. Instead, we stayed there, tangled in the blankets, her body curled against mine for warmth. I could feel the rise and fall of her breath steady now, and the faint tremor in her hands had stopped. The firelight danced across her face, softening the lines of exhaustion, and for a moment she looked younger, not in years, but in the way she let her guard down, like she was finally resting. I pulled the blanket tighter around us, my arm draped over her shoulder, and she didn't pull away. It was the kind of closeness that didn't need words, the kind that said more in its quiet than any conversation could. At some point we drifted off, not fully asleep, but in that hazy space between waking and dreaming. The fire popped softly, the wind a low hum outside, and the world felt far away. I woke once in the night, my neck stiff from the hard bench, and found Elena still pressed against me, her breath warm against my collarbone. Her hair smelled faintly of pine and snow, and I didn't move, not wanting to break whatever this was. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and for a second, we just looked at each other in the dim light. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Yeah," I said softly. "Not going anywhere." She gave a small nod, her lips curving into a faint smile, and closed her eyes again. We talked a little through the night in fragments when the cold or the creak of the cabin woke us. She told me about a photo she'd taken once in a desert halfway across the world of a soldier holding a letter from home, his face lit by a single candle. "It was the only time I cried on assignment," she said. Not because it was sad, but because it was so human. I told her about the time I stayed up all night coding a website for a client, only to realize I'd built something I was actually proud of, something that felt like mine. "I don't tell people about that," I admitted. "It feels too small." She shook her head, her hand resting on my arm. "Nothing's small if it matters to you." The hours passed like that, in quiet exchanges and long stretches of silence that didn't feel heavy. I don't know when we fell asleep for real, but when I woke again, the storm had quieted, and a faint gray light seeped through the cabin's window. The fire was down to embers, and the air was colder now, sharp against my face. Elena was still beside me, her head on my shoulder, one hand tucked under the blanket resting against my chest. I didn't want to move, didn't want to let go of this moment, but the world was coming back, and I could feel it. Then we heard it, a low, rhythmic thump in the distance, growing louder. A helicopter. My heart jumped, relief mixing with something else, something like regret. Elena stirred, lifting her head, her eyes blinking against the dawn. "They found us," she said, her voice soft but steady. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The thumping grew louder, and I could hear faint shouts now, voices calling through the snow. I stood, my legs stiff, and helped her up. Her hand lingered in mine, warm and firm, and she squeezed it once hard before letting go. "Thank you, Lucas," she said, her eyes meeting mine, steady but unreadable. "For last night." I didn't know what to say. The weight of what had happened, what we'd shared, was still settling in my chest. "You don't have to thank me," I said finally. "I'm glad it was us." She nodded, her lips pressing into a small smile, and then she turned to gather her things, her thermos, her scarf, my jacket. The cabin felt smaller now, like the world outside was already crowding in. We pushed the door open, the cold air hitting us like a slap, and stepped out into the snow. The helicopter's lights flashed in the distance, and I could see figures moving toward us, their voices muffled but urgent. Elena's hand brushed mine one last time, a fleeting touch, and then she stepped forward, her red scarf bright against the white, ready to meet the world again. The helicopter's roar filled the air as we stepped out of the cabin, the snow crunching under our boots. The sky was still heavy with clouds, but the storm had eased, leaving a quiet gray dawn. My breath caught in my throat, not just from the cold, but from the weight of leaving that small, warm space behind the cabin, the fire, the night with Elena. She stood beside me, her red scarf stark against her dark coat, her face composed but distant, like she was already pulling herself back into the role of Jake's mom. I wanted to say something, anything to hold on to what we'd shared, but the words stuck in my chest as the rescue team's lights cut through the haze. A ranger in a bright orange jacket waved us over, shouting something I couldn't make out over the chopper's thrum. Elena moved first, her steps steady despite the deep snow, and I followed, my legs heavy from the cold and lack of sleep. As we got closer, I saw Jake among the group, his face pale and frantic. He broke into a run, stumbling through the snow, and threw his arms around Elena, nearly knocking her over. "Mom." Thank God, he choked out, his voice cracking, like he was 15 again. He turned to me, grabbing my shoulder, his eyes wet. "Lucas, man." I thought he didn't finish, just pulled me into a quick, tight hug. I nodded, my throat tight, unable to meet Elena's gaze. The Rangers bundled us into the chopper, wrapping us in thermal blankets that crinkled like foil. Elena sat across from me, her hands folded in her lap, her scarf tucked neatly under her chin. She looked calm, almost detached, but when our eyes met for a split second, I saw it. A flicker of something unspoken. Something only we knew. She squeezed my hand once so quick it could have been a reflex, then let go, turning to Jake as he bombarded her with questions. "We're fine," she said, her voice steady, the same voice she'd used to calm me in the storm. "Just got lost. Lucas kept us together." Jake clapped my back, grinning through his relief. "You're a damn hero, man." I forced a smile, but my chest ached. Hero wasn't the word for what I felt. Back at the lodge, it was chaos. Paramedics checking us over, Jake's friends crowding around the lodge staff, offering hot coffee and blankets. I went through the motions, answering questions about the storm, the cabin, the fire. But my mind was still back there in that quiet space where it was just me and Elena. She was across the room talking to a ranger, her posture straight, her smile polite. She was Jake's mom again, the woman who kept everything in check. I wanted to catch her eye to see if she felt the same pull I did, but she didn't look my way. We left Aspen the next day, the group quieter than when we'd arrived. Jake drove blasting his usual playlist, but I barely heard it, staring out the window at the snow-covered peaks fading into the distance. Elena sat in the front, her thermos in her lap, answering Jake's chatter with short, warm responses. I tried to act normal, joking with Jake, but every time I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, my stomach twisted. That night in the cabin wasn't just a moment, it had changed something in me, and I couldn't shake the feeling it had changed her too. Back in Denver, life snapped back to its old rhythm, but it didn't fit right anymore. I went back to coding, running my quiet apartment, but it all felt hollow. I texted Elena a few days later, just a simple, "You okay?" No reply. I tried again a week later, asking if she wanted to grab coffee, maybe talk. Nothing. I told myself she was busy, that she needed space, but the silence stung. I started second-guessing everything, the kiss, the way she'd leaned into me, the words she'd said about wanting to be seen. Maybe I'd read it all wrong. A month later, I worked up the nerve to stop by Jake's house. He'd invited me over to watch a game, and I figured I'd see her, maybe get some kind of answer. When I got there, Jake was in the living room, sprawled on the couch with a beer. "Mom's out," he said, not looking up from the TV. I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment, and sank into the couch. Then I saw it on the wall, a new photo framed, of a snowy forest, pines heavy with powder, and a red scarf hanging on a bare branch, stark against the white. It hit me like a punch. That was our forest, our night captured in a way only she could. I stared at it, my chest tight, until Jake's voice snapped me out of it. "Yo, Lucas, you good? You're staring at that picture like it's gonna talk?" I forced a laugh. "Just didn't know your mom was into photography like that." He shrugged. "Yeah, she's always been weirdly good at it. I stayed for the game, but my mind wasn't there." All I could think about was that scarf that moment and the way Elena had looked at me in the firelight. As I left, Jake called after me. Hey, you sure you're okay? You've been weird since the trip. I turned, meeting his eyes, and for a second, I wondered if he knew something. Yeah, I said, my voice steady, just tired. But as I walked to my car, the weight of that night settled deeper, a quiet ache that wouldn't leave. The drive back to my apartment was quiet, the streets of Denver glowing under the soft yellow of streetlights. Jake's words echoed in my head, but it was that photo on the wall, the snowy forest, the red scarf, that wouldn't let me go. It was like Elena had taken our secret and turned it into something tangible, something she could keep without saying a word. I wanted to believe it meant she hadn't forgotten that she felt the same pull I did, but her silence told a different story. Days turned into weeks, and the ache in my chest didn't fade. I kept coding, kept running, kept living. But it was like moving through fog. Everything blurred, nothing quite solid. I didn't try to contact her again. I told myself it was for the best, that whatever happened in that cabin was a moment, not a promise. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Her green eyes catching the firelight, her voice soft and raw, saying she wanted to be seen. I saw the way her hand had curled into mine, the way she'd smiled when I draped my jacket over her shoulders. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the way we'd held onto each other, like we were both afraid to let go. One evening about 2 months after the trip, I came home from a run, my breath still heavy, my shoes caked with mud. There was a small package on my doorstep wrapped in plain brown paper. No label, no note. My heart stuttered as I picked it up, the weight light but deliberate. Inside my apartment, I tore it open, and there it was. Her red scarf neatly folded, the soft wool still carrying a faint trace of her perfume like pine and coffee. Tucked inside was a piece of paper, her handwriting clean and careful. Not the last night, but not the first either. I know I can knock if I need to. I stood there holding the scarf, my pulse loud in my ears. It wasn't an invitation, not exactly, but it was something, a door left, cracked open, a possibility. I pressed the scarf to my face, breathing it in, and for a moment, I was back in that cabin, her head on my shoulder, the fire crackling. The note wasn't a promise, but it was enough. It told me she hadn't forgotten that the night we'd shared had left a mark on her too. I didn't see Elena again for a while. Life kept moving. Jake got a promotion, started talking about moving to Seattle, and I threw myself into a new coding project. Something that kept me up late enough to quiet my thoughts. But I kept the scarf on a shelf in my room, next to a stack of books I never got around to reading. It wasn't a trophy or a keepsake. It was a reminder that some moments don't need to last forever to matter. They just need to happen. Sometimes I'd drive by Jake's house, not to stop, just to see if her car was in the driveway. Most times it was, and I'd feel a strange mix of relief and longing, like knowing she was there was enough even if I couldn't reach her. Once I saw her in the front yard watering her plants, her hair tied back, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't see me and I didn't stop. But I smiled because she looked okay. Not happy, maybe, but steady, like she was finding her way back to herself. The truth is, I didn't need her to knock. I didn't need us to pick up where we left off, to steal more moments or make promises we couldn't keep. That night in the cabin had given me something I hadn't realized. I was missing, a glimpse of what it felt like to be needed, to see someone else's walls come down and know they trusted you to catch them. Elena had shown me that, not just in her words or her touch, but in the way she'd let me see her, really see her without the masks she wore for the world. I don't know if our paths will cross again, not the way they did that night. Maybe she'll stay Jake's mom, the woman who waves politely when I drop by, or maybe one day she'll knock and we'll find out what comes next. But for now, I carry that night with me, not as a weight, but as a warmth, like the fire we built together. It wasn't about love in the way people write songs about. It was quieter, messier, real. It was about two people finding each other in the middle of a storm, not because they had to, but because they chose to. I folded the scarf and put it back on the shelf next to the note. And I smiled, not because I had her, but because I'd known her even for a moment. That was enough. For now, it had to be. Bye-bye.